access indecent images of children and what risks that they pose. And I start off with a joke which Stephen Smallbone was always very fond of, and I have shamelessly taken from him. And he always used to say, there are two kinds of people in this world: those who think there are two kinds of people and those who don't. And it's a little bit like this as we go through this presentation, because we're looking for unique risk signifiers, ways that we can tell who's going to carry on to commit very serious offences, or is there some unique child pornography or child indecent images of children that someone might have, which may signify something in particular that allows us to know that they're likely to carry on and to be of a significant risk to children or more generally. Fortunately, we do know an awful lot, and there's still an awful lot for us to know in the future. And during this presentation, I hope to kind of draw out the majority of these themes. My initial involvement with this area was with the Australian Federal Police. They were interested in prioritising some of the complaints which they'd had, some of the referrals they had, often with very scant information, often data dumps from overseas countries where they would suddenly be confronted with 1,000 referrals or 1,000 IP addresses or a number of email addresses when they had to try and find out what to do, who to prioritise. And I helped them to develop some of those protocols. Now, some of the tools we used then was the KeyRat, and the KeyRat is a tool which is kind of top secret, and so I won't be able to talk about that today. But fortunately, there's something which is almost identical to the KeyRat, which isn't top secret, which I will be able to talk about today. And I think it's a great thing that these tools are out there in the open literature, because I think kind of shining that light of where data comes from, how decisions are made, is a way that really drives things forward. So I'm really grateful that we have CETO who's devised something very similar. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? Well, first of all, let's talk about what accessing pornography means. Well, pretty much all young men are accessing pornography on the internet. So probably an easy way of starting this off is to ask young men what they're accessing and why. So I'm looking for young men. Women, not all women are accessing child pornography, so you can breathe a sigh of relief. And young men. I'm doing this to illustrate a point. The point is that it's embarrassing, even if you're accessing legal pornography, it's embarrassing to talk about. We're very reluctant to talk about it. And that's our first problem with looking at what's happening with people who are accessing indecent images. We're not quite sure what they're doing with it. We're not quite sure what's normal. You know, we're all embarrassed to talk about it. And as I come to the later points for improving how we respond to people who are accessing indecent images of children, I think we need to know much more from them about how they're starting to use images, how they're continuing to use images, and in some cases when they desist, how they are desisting too. I have been on Pornhub this morning. Pornhub is, I believe, the most popular pornographic website in the world. I got this from Wikipedia. It was extensive research I was doing this morning, as you can imagine. And one of the things that you can find from these porn sites is that they have their most viewed videos. So what I thought I'd do is I'd look at what the top 3 most viewed videos are in the most popular website for pornography. Anyone want to guess what they might be? No? No one been on Pornhub this morning? Well, I'll give you the top 3 now. So number 3, family strokes, MILF, mother I'd like to fuck, step-mom fucks son. That was 3,602, 3 million plus. Stepson fucks his mum while she's stuck. This had a picture of a woman stuck underneath a glass table. I didn't actually go through the whole lot of these things. I just got as far as there. And then number 1 with over 9 million views, Mom, Alison Tyler and Son. Interesting kind of a choice. I think there's a little bit of a bias in these because if you imagine the whole range of pornography that's out there. I think, say if it's for conventional missionary sex, there's probably lots and lots of videos that people can watch, so they probably don't get quite as many hits as there's more specialist marks. So I'm not sure that actually reflects a real interest in this particular kind of material. They use it as an illustration of what people are looking at. Now I'm going to go on to the prevalence of paraphilic fantasies in the male general population. Now these are fantasies. These aren't actually full-blown DSM paraphilias because that requires a much more compulsive element and the causing problems for themselves or for other people. So this is just the fantasies. And as you can see here, you've got fetishes. This might be a foot fetish. It might be kind of bra fetish and so on. 30% sadistic, just getting close to 22%. Voyeuristic, 35%. Frotteuristic, 13.4%. And all of them combined get to about 58.6%. So most men will have some paraphilic fantasies. Now the reason I put this in here is that when we're scrutinizing people who are committing offenses, we can often find out things which are actually quite prevalent in the population in general. And we have to be really careful to decide what is genuinely a risk factor and what is something which is typical of the population at large. Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? First, I'm going to talk about why it's important to assess risk formally. Rather than simply looking at the kind of stuff they're looking at and saying, well, that's disgusting, they're a terrible person, they're high risk. There's a real merit to doing risk assessments formally and actually putting some kind of detail about, firstly, what you've done, and also around some of the evidence about why you've done that and what it's likely to show. Then I'm going to talk about what accessing particular images mean. There's a whole range of images out there. I'll talk actually later on about the potential offences that people can commit. And there's an incredible breadth of offending, from wanting to look at a child in the distance naked, right up to sadistic murders with torture and enjoying the pain of the child whilst doing so. The same happens with images as well. There's such a great deal of variation that trying to know exactly what one means, whether it's deliberately solicited or whether it's just because opportunistically that image was there, is always going to be a challenge. And I'll talk about some of the evidence around that. The Child Pornography Offender Risk Tool, or CPORT. This is from CETO, and those of you familiar with risk assessment will see there's an awful lot of overlap. I mean, if it's not too gross a thing to say, that these risk assessments are incredibly incestuous. They're always including very similar things, partly because if you start going backwards, they almost always end up with Andrews and Bonter, and there's a certain, I think, arrogance with some people who create these scales where they think it's their work, when in fact it's really quite derivative, especially from Andrews and Bonter and also Matrix 2000, Static 99. And you'll see a lot of similarities, those of you who are familiar with those tools today. But risk of what? As psychologists, I'm a psychologist myself, and if you look at what we do risk assessment with, we look at groups which are in prisons, because we collect loads of lovely data about them, and then we can find out later if they recidivate. Or we use forensic mental health facilities because, again, we assess people, we collect the data, and then we find out if they turn up on our systems again. And so what's happened with a lot of the risk assessment tools is that they are looking for, do you reoffend? Because that's easy to do. It appears easily in the statistics. But for me, an equally, perhaps more important question is, well, what are they actually likely to do? We may be prepared to tolerate someone who indecently exposes himself to adult women from a distance. We might be prepared to tolerate a high-risk person who's very likely to reoffend, but the consequences may not be so great. Whereas someone who may be a much lower risk of offending, but if they do offend, they may kill the child to prevent them being a witness, we may be much more concerned about that person, even though they may be of lower risk. And I'm going to talk about a case-based approach. Sometimes when you use these risk assessment tools, you look at the person you've assessed and you come up with a conclusion that this is wrong. Now, all good risk assessment will use a risk test as part of a broad-based psychological assessment that may include clinical interviews, collateral reviews, and actual details, including clinical judgments about what they've done and what they might do in the future. And from the evidence which we'll see, I think you still have to do that. There's no silver bullet that provides a really simple, easy, and always accurate way of assessing risk. And I'll draw the final conclusions. Before I go on to talking about, well, do people who access internet pornography or child indecent images of children go on to commit contact offences, I'd like to start off by saying there's actually a lot of reasons to be concerned about people who are just accessing indecent images of children and not going on to offend. You know, from the first point is it's illegal, and so if it is illegal, it's a law which should be enforced. If we have laws, we should enforce them. If we're not going to enforce them, we shouldn't make them laws. So that's one point. A second point is that it may stimulate demand. You know, the production of these materials may encourage the victimization of children because it may encourage people to create these images for transmission to other people. And so that can be either for sale, but also for kudos. We know that some of our child sex offenders are sharing images to show that they have access to children and to get prestige in their narrow social group who enjoys this kind of material. Then there's the idea that exposure to indecent images of children may facilitate interest. You know, that if you're thinking about classic desensitization to a phobia, you'd have repeated positive associations with that phobic cue. In the same way with child sex offenders, it's potentially possible that people may overcome some of their objections by repeatedly masturbating to indecent images of children, and that may disinhibit them to be able to commit offences in the future. There's a really important but unknown, I think it's important, of course I'm speculating, addition, which is we don't know what the harm of indecent images of children actually does to those victims. Clearly being abused, we've got a good range of evidence which shows that being abused can have very traumatic and persistent effects. But if you think about people who've accessed indecent images of you, you don't know who those people are. So for some victims, they may be walking down the street, not sure, but aware that the different people that pass them may have seen them being abused as a child. And for many people, and of course for adults with some of the revenge porn and so on, this can be very upsetting. And we don't have good data of quite what an effect it has. There's some speculation that for people who are young children who look very different, it has less an effect. Whereas for older teenagers who still look like they looked when they were abused, it may have a more profound and protracted effect. But we don't really know. But it's something that we must think about when we are thinking of people accessing decent images of children. And the final one is that accessing indecent images of children may indicate that you have an interest, a sexual interest in children, which may mean that you're currently abusing children, may mean that you're going to abuse children in the future, or it may mean that you've abused children in the past as well. So there's a great deal of reasons why why we should pay particular attention to accessing these images of children. I'm going to move on to formal risk assessment. And there's a number of reasons for doing this. I know in some organisations, formal risk assessment is seen as something which is laborious, time-consuming, something which takes away their own individual, the risk assessor's individual ability to make decisions. But there are some very good reasons for doing professional risk assessments. The first is to guide decisions for investigation, prosecution, and sentencing. Yeah. The idea behind this being that if someone is of incredibly high risk, then you would be more likely to want to prosecute them, more likely to investigate them thoroughly, more likely to apply for stricter supervision or a longer sentence and so on. I should say that this is some work which Francesca Brown and myself did, and I'm just going to actually point out Francesca because, or Ches, as she's often known. Do you want to put your hand up there, Ches? There you go, just in case anyone wants to have a chat to her about the kind of work we've done. I know she's very much like that. And for institutional placement, for example, if you were going to choose people to go to treatment, for example, in our jails, not all jails provide treatment. You've also got to have longer sentences in order to make treatment available for you. You would want to have some kind of risk assessment in order to tailor institutions and treatment to people. And this is relevant to the risk needs responsivity model. The idea that you put your most resources into your highest risk offenders, you tackle the needs which they have, the needs which are causing, criminogenic needs which are causing their offending, and you do things which are responsive. You do procedures which are actually going to change their risk and make them less likely to offend. For supervision in the community, for example, with our Child Protection Offender Register, there are offenders in the community, limited resources. Where do you target your resources? Who do you monitor most frequently? Who do you monitor in most depth? Who do you train your investigators up to investigate, look out for risk factors most thoroughly and interview most thoroughly? Determining access to children. As you see, as we go through this, the easiest ones are the high risks, the ones that have done something horrible and they've done it frequently, because they're easy to pick out. They're the ones that you go, well, this person shouldn't have access to children, this person deserves a long custodial sentence. The difficult ones are the ones which are the low risk, and for those people it's, well, should they have access to their own children? Should they, if they start a relationship with someone else, should they have access to the other their new partner's children? Should they be in a position where they can have access to children? And they're much more challenging when the evidence isn't quite so strong that they are a substantial risk. And finally, to show fairness. You're making decisions which have a profound impact on people's lives. And so you need to be able to demonstrate why you've made those decisions, that they weren't done randomly, they weren't done on prejudice, that they were done with a fair, transparent way. And in addition, it gives you kind of an audit trail so you can see how decisions are made. And also for research, it lets you know, well, what actually works, what actually did predict what happened. For us now, we're not quite sure what's going to happen over the next 5 years. So we're always going to be behind the 8 ball, as it were. So finding out these factors a priori is important. So what are the key risk factors? I love simplicity, and as we get to the seaport, you can see there is quite a lot of simplicity into it. We'll have a bit of a complex stuff in the middle, then we'll get into some more kind of simple stuff. But if you look at key risk factors, antisociality, this is one of the major risk factors, and Hansen et al. have found this repeatedly. Personality traits, attitudes and beliefs and behaviours that underlie general criminality. Preparedness to violate social rules, often associated with impulsivity as well. Lack of remorse for offences which are committed. Then, atypical sexuality. Now, a lot of our offenders are antisocial, especially our significant offenders who commit a lot of offences. But what's different about our sex offenders and our preferential sex offenders is their atypical sexuality, reflecting paraphilic sexual interests, excessive sexual preoccupation, and other extreme or unusual aspects of sexuality. Now, I've already pointed out some of the difficulties about looking at what is actually abnormal, but certainly looking in more detail about atypical sexuality is going to be critical. Final one, opportunity. I put this in from Stephen Smallbone and Richard Wortley. If there's no opportunity for a victim, then no offence can occur. Now, clearly with internet facilitated offences, you can contact a child via webcam anywhere in the world from the privacy of your room. But for contact offences, you can travel, but also you still have to actually get that contact with a child. You still have to have that access to them. And for some people who may be more autistic may not actually have that capability of going out and finding children to offend against. Diversity of material. How ugly is this? That's unreadable, isn't it? I thought it might be bigger with a big thing at the back. Okay. I'll pause, have some wine to work out this. Okay. What does this slide say? Basically, this is CETO stuff, CETO and X stuff, 2015. Great article. I think if you're going to read one article, read this article. Great review, great kind of in-depth thing. What they did is they looked at just over 280 convicted sex offenders, and they looked at their police files. So rather than looking at prison files, correctional files, they looked at the police files. Now that means that you get access to web chat, access to images, information about what they said in their suspect interview. I'm going to come back to suspect interviews because I think there's a lot of information which can be gleaned from suspect interviews. A lot of people confess relatively readily. In fact, maybe I'll just talk about it now. A lot of people confess very readily. The best reason to get people to confess is strong evidence. They think you can prove it. If you've been accessing indecent images of children, if they've seized your computer, only you've got access to it, you're pretty much hung out to dry. There's pretty much no defense. So most people are relatively cooperative and prepared to talk to police. Often, you're getting excuses like, I was abused as a child and I was curious about what had happened because I couldn't remember, so I wanted to look at images to find out. And of course, you can discredit these accounts by saying, well, did you really need 20,000 images to find out? And also, they all are girls being abused, but you're a boy. And you can see the point. So maybe you always have to treat it with a pinch of salt. But often, there are honest accounts about how people started doing it, how they continued it, about dynamic factors as people excuse their behavior, for example, depression, not having sex with their partner, and so on. So I think there's a great deal more information we can actually glean from offenders themselves. What does this say here, though? This is it's saying about the materials themselves. So they've basically analysed it in different ways. If you look at it, you've got what they've called child pornography, because this is Canadian work. Clearly, we need to be doing this here in Australia as well, and we kind of are doing it, but hopefully it'll be made public. Not by me, I should say. But if you look at the materials that people have, most people also had adult pornography as well. It's difficult to know in contemporary society because people have moved from downloading images and looking at them on a computer to streaming images. And because pornography with adults isn't illegal, people don't need to save it and hide it. So sometimes you're finding child pornography or child indecent images of children, but not adult pornography. That doesn't mean that they're not looking at adult pornography. This stuff, because it was done a little while ago, has quite a lot of people who've got a lot of adult pornography as well. But if you look at the materials, you've got what they've called child pornography. You've got boys, girls. There's a range of acts that you can have in child pornography. We once, Elke Perdacker and myself were coding everyone in Woolston Correctional Centre for what they've done. And it's amazing the permutations, without being too graphic, you can get someone to touch your penis, you can touch someone else's penis, you can put their penis in your mouth, you can get them to put their penis in your mouth, you can lick, I mean, it just goes on and on. It's amazing how many different behaviours you can show and how unique almost many offenders are. But what this means is for categorising pornography, it doesn't neatly get categorised, especially when you've got multiple sex acts over a kind of a series. So you've got the child pornography with girls, with boys. You've got nudity, where there actually isn't any sexual aspect to it beyond the child being nude. And then you've got material where there's just a child in it. So it may be your relatives, it may be a collection of photos from catalogues, it may be people you've seen in the streets that you've just taken pictures of. When they're not naked, they are just children. And they may be boys or girls, depending on people's preferences. With the categories, they vary. You can have infants and toddlers, prepubescent, and pubescent. So that would be kind of the prepubescent being for your typical paedophile, and the hebephile being for your post-pubescent, going up to final adulthood. They've got the categories there, and the big finding is there actually isn't a whole lot of difference there between the groups, which are people who had child pornography only, people who had child pornography and were committing contact offences. There wasn't any kind of unique signifier which really kind of stood out. Interestingly, a lot of the people looking at anime stuff as well, which, although I didn't get as far as it, when it gets to Pornhub, I think that was number 4 when I was looking this morning, was actually an anime thing, which was, I didn't actually have time to look at it, but it was, we were speculating earlier actually about why people like this, and apparently some young people find that it's less messy and icky than actual sex because it's kind of a cartoon fantasy and, you know, kind of a bit more, what would the word be for it, less earthy than real sex, I guess. Moving on to this slide. This is showing, I think this kind of shows some of the breadth of behaviour. I'm not sure how visible it's going to be. Essentially, the different kind of coloured lines indicate the different people. So the total group, those who committed contact sex offences, non-violent and or violent offending, so people who have just recidivated, you know, from the antisocial side of things, or child pornography only, only there. And you can see here an interesting diversity. So you've got a few people with gerontophilia. Is that how it's pronounced? Yep, thank you. You know, who are basically kind of attracted to older people. So interesting diversity. You've got people with child pornography and pornography concerning the old as well. And with this, it's not always clear whether there's an interest present or indicative. And so, for example, if in your porn collection, say you've got one file, all your porn's in it, and there's some older people in there, it's not clear whether that is a real interest of yours. However, if you have your own file, porn involving older people, tick, 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 heart, and then there's lots of stuff in there that indicates that you do have a real interest in this, and it's something you've deliberately actively gone out and selected. And when you start looking through the other material as well, you've got sexual violence, voyeurism, bestiality, indicative or present, and as you can see, you've got a variety of others as well. Now, there were some weak links, which I'll come to probably when I get to the risk assessment tool, because they nicely distilled the ones which were predictive into the risk assessment tool. I might leave that up later if people want to kind of peruse it with some wine afterwards. So what is the Child Pornography Offender Risk Tool, the CPORT? Okay, first one, offender age. You know, well documented, young people commit more sex offences than old people. You know, older people get tired, you know, our libido decreases, we can't chase after people as much as we used to be able to in consensual ways in my context. And just realised that could be taken the wrong way. Age 35 or younger. I should add that caveat that I have been working with the police for a long time, which gives me a dark sense of humour, which I'm blaming on them. They might blame it on me, but I'm going to blame it on them. Any prior criminal history, coded as higher if yes. So basically, you can see this one will tap into that antisocial aspect, you know, if you're committing offences. Any prior index contact sexual offence history, coded as higher if the answer is yes. Any prior or index failure on conditional release, such as probation, parole, or conditional release, coded as higher risk if yes. So those of you familiar with some of the risk assessment tools will recognise a bit of Static 99, a bit of Matrix 2000 here. You've got a bit of SVR there, a bit of PCLR in that last one. You know, kind of the revocation of conditional release. Indication of paedophilic or hebephilic interests, coded as higher if yes. So how do you know this? Now this is kind of always the challenge, isn't it? You know, if they said it in the police interview, that is a really good way of knowing. You know, and this is one of the interesting things about web chat, you can sometimes see what people have been talking about over a period of a year. You know, so if they're talking about their interests in this kind of environment which they think is safe, then it gives you an idea what their interests are. If they're telling other people about it, and also the persistence of it if they're talking about it for a year. Often you can see other problems as well. If they've got anxiety problems, they talk about it. If they're drunk, they often talk about it. From talking about being hungover, so you've got some idea of whether they have any alcohol problems as well. Ratio of boy to girl content in child pornography. So you might recognize this from the Matrix 2000, for example. People who abuse boys are slightly, it's actually when you look at the stats, it's only a slight difference. It's not a massive difference. Are more likely to be higher risk than those who are offending against girls. And similarly, they find the ratio of boy to girl content in child pornography coded as higher risk if there was more content depicting boys. Ratio of boy to girl content in nudity and other child content coded as high risk if there was more. So you kind of got the two aspects to it, the actual indecent images and also kind of just being interested in nude children. How are we doing for time? 10 minutes ago? Okay, lovely. But risk of what? This is the most important thing. And there is some evidence that if people start actually looking through case files of what people have done, then it can actually improve the quality of their risk assessment. I was talking to Jim Ogloff, and his idea around risk assessment is you look at likelihood of offending, but you also need to look at what the severity of offending is going to be. You can't have one without the other. It complicates things, but it does mean that we are taking into account kind of the seriousness of offending. As a community, we lock people up in jail all the time, and we know that about 60 to 70% of them will reoffend. We're prepared to take that risk because most of them aren't going to reoffend in a really serious way that has I'm really careful in what I'm saying, that has really profound life-changing effects on their victims. And similarly with sex offenders, we may be prepared to take more risks with people who may access more indecent images of children than we are with people who may commit much more serious protected offences against children. And we need to be thinking about what they are likely to do. In a way, the most challenging part, as I said at the beginning, is those lower risk offenders. High risk offenders, easy to identify, and also we don't have the same moral need to give them a second or third chance. If you committed lots of serious sex offences, then your chances for redemption may have run out. And for those people, best predictor of future behaviour being past behaviour, we can be reasonably sure of who they are. The lower risk ones, and of course if you think about it, everyone, if you're looking at offending history, starts out as low risk because everyone has to start somewhere. Everyone starts with no offences to their name. And they're the much more tricky ones. They're the ones we have to be much more careful. And that's essentially what I was saying here. Okay, and I said that. And we've also always got the problem with this, that the actual offences that we see in convictions, firstly, there's a delay of typically 2 years from charge to ending up in court. And conviction rates, we've got, 15% of rapes being reported, and of those, about half resulting in convictions. We have very little idea of actually what's happening. And so we need to know more about what actually is happening in our community. And I think innovative aspects of policing like our Project Arrow, where you can make anonymous reports about what's happened to you, or talking to sex abuse survivors groups to find out what people are telling them, can be an innovative way of finding out what's actually happening in the community, which isn't reflected in the statistics. I think we also need to talk to young people, because by the time we're aware of a trend, for example, I only found out about Netflix and chill about a month ago. And I don't know how long has that been around for? I don't know. Years. And no one told me. And same with aubergines, and I only found out about them about a month ago. And also, I've become so paranoid, I've got a young daughter, and we sometimes send ourselves each other emojis, and so I have to check that a unicorn didn't mean something inappropriate before I sent it, and apparently it does so far. I mean, next week it might not, but this week it does. And so we need to find out about that. And I think we need to improve the data. We need to know more about what's going on. We need to know more from police and the interviews which they have. We're unique with some of these sex offenders in that we have information about when they accessed it, how long they accessed things for. With web chats, we may have what they've got up to every night for a year. So we have unique abilities to find out about these people. It poses a challenge too. For example, these risk assessments by CETO, they took between half a day and 3 days to code each offender. So that's much longer than it would take to code a typical offender for a risk assessment, even on something like the SVR 20, let alone something like the Risk Matrix 2000. But it's through doing that we're going to find out what's actually happening and what the risk factors are. We need to look at what the sexual interests are and how they're manifested, how we can understand them, how we can identify them, and how we can use them to predict risk. We need to look at specific people in the community. We can require them to hand over phones, which allows us to know who their contacts are, to know whether they have offending histories which involve abusing children and so on. We have new ways of doing that which should be quite effective, or potentially could be quite effective. And we need to look at the situational factors as well. We need to pay attention to the situations in which people abuse and try and reduce those factors. And for some people, it's going to be paying lots of attention to those acute risk factors, like complete emotional breakdown of intimate relationships, to see if they are suddenly becoming much higher risk. And finally, we've got to think about what they might do. The last thing is looking at how offending is changing. If you look at how offending is changing, we didn't foresee this 20 years ago. If you look at, say, the profound differences which have happened to conventional sexuality, young people are having less sex, less frequently, and we weren't able to predict that. And some of the reasons seem to be is that they're having difficulty getting aroused because they don't get off their electronic devices long enough to actually become physically aroused, or they're masturbating to porn, so they've just ejaculated so they don't feel like having sex, or the images from pornography require women to be completely depilated, and unless a woman has just shaved every inch of her body. I know I actually can empathise with women who have to do that myself. They feel that their partner not be attracted. And if you talk to some young men about their expectations of women, it's just ridiculous. But there's all sorts of things that change, and things will continue to change. Porn can become much more immersive than we could have anticipated 20 years ago, and can become more immersive still in the future. And quite what it's going to do to people, we're not entirely sure. Generally, our urges for power, for sex, for food, for clothing, for shelter, Maslow's hierarchy of needs are going to stay the same. But there is potential for this really immersive pornography to try and change our behaviours. With that, there's lots we know. We are gathering more and more information. We certainly know generally good predictor of future behaviour tends to be past behaviour, but there's a lot more we can do to refine that and add some more substance to it. I'm going to end there. Thank you.